$1 poor son and $100 million rich son. Billionaire shocked to discover the truth. A sudden whisper tore through the cold air of Central Park. Impossible. He looks exactly like my son. Jonathan Hale, a billionaire wrapped in power yet bound by secrets, froze as his gaze locked on a little boy clinging to a young woman in worn jeans. Two identical faces. Two worlds colliding under the grey sky of New York. Behind wealth and glittering towers lay betrayal, poverty, and a truth too heavy to hide. What would you have done in his place? Welcome to Emotional Echoes, a channel where emotions come alive, and every story leaves a lasting echo in your heart. Please subscribe to Emotional Echoes channel. Help us reach 1,000 subscribers so more souls can feel these stories. Stay with my video till the very end and let me know where you're watching from so I can see how far this story spreads. Now, let me tell you what happened. Central Park was alive with spring laughter, the sound of children chasing each other across the grass. Jonathan Hale, at 45, walked beside his wife, the weight of his empire still clinging to his shoulders. He was used to controlling markets and bending men to his will, but he had never learned how to silence the quiet loneliness that followed him like a shadow. He smiled faintly as he watched his son, Lucas, run toward the slide, his little hands waving with excitement. For a moment, pride softened the hard lines of Jonathan's face. Then his gaze drifted across the playground, and the air seemed to leave his lungs. There, on the other side, another boy was laughing, the same bright eyes, the same wild hair, the same face as his own son. Jonathan stopped, his chest tightening. Impossible, he whispered to himself. Yet the truth stared back at him in the shape of a child who could not be denied. His heart pounded in his ears, a storm rising as he felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Victoria's hand shot out, gripping his arm with nervous force, her voice sharp as she urged him to keep walking. But Jonathan could not move. His eyes locked on the young woman crouched beside the boy, tying his shoelace with gentle, worn hands. Emily lifted her head, her face pale with exhaustion, but lit with a mother's tenderness. She froze under Jonathan's burning stare, fear flickering across her features, as if she had been caught in a secret she never meant to share. She pulled the boy close and turned away, her steps quick, her shoulders tense. Jonathan's breath came shallow, his mind racing with dread. Two children, two identical faces, and a question clawing at his soul that he could no longer ignore. 4 years earlier, Emily Carter lived in a cramped apartment above a laundromat, her days divided between classes and long shifts at the diner. She dreamed of graduating, of one day working in an office where her hands didn't smell like grease, but survival always came first. Books and bills competed for her attention, and she carried both with equal weight. When Ryan walked into her life, it felt like a door finally opening. He was kind at first, waiting for her after shifts, walking her home through the cold streets, telling her she deserved more than the tired life she had been handed. Emily believed him. She let herself imagine a future, maybe even a family, a chance at love that could lighten her struggles. But the sweetness turned bitter the night he betrayed her. His promises disappeared, replaced by laughter that cut her deeper than any insult. He used her innocence as if it meant nothing, and when she needed him most, he vanished without a word. The boy who had spoken of forever left her to carry shame and silence alone. Emily tried to push forward, burying her heartbreak under double shifts and late-night study sessions. She told herself the exhaustion, explained her dizziness, her missed meals, the growing heaviness in her body. Too poor for a doctor, too scared to ask for help, she convinced herself it was only stress. She never knew there were two lives growing inside her. The night of labor came suddenly, dragging her to a community hospital with flickering lights and peeling walls. Nurses whispered as they passed, their eyes sharp with judgment. Emily clutched the thin sheet of the bed, crying out as pain tore through her, feeling more alone than she ever had in her life. The delivery was quick, the doctor's face set in an unreadable mask. One child was placed in her arms, tiny and warm against her trembling chest. But the doctor slipped away with another, hidden in the shadows of the sterile room. He returned minutes later, his voice flat, detached, carrying no joy or compassion. "Congratulations, Miss Carter," he said. "It's a boy. Just one." Emily believed him. Her tears fell as she kissed her son's soft forehead, whispering apologies she didn't even understand. She thought the exhaustion made her heart ache so sharply, unaware that half of her soul had been stolen that night. Her dreams of college and a brighter future slipped away as she held the boy close, vowing to protect him, never knowing that another part of her life had already been torn away. Victoria Hale had spent years drowning in silence every time someone asked when she would give Jonathan a child. Nothing had worked. Treatments, prayers, and whispered promises had all ended in heartbreak. When the doctor placed Emily's stolen newborn in her arms, desperation turned to dangerous resolve. She whispered to him that no one must ever know, not even her husband. From that moment, Victoria built her performance carefully. She padded her dresses with pillows, staged bouts of morning sickness, and spoke of cravings she never had. At night, she complained of back pain and fatigue, crafting every detail of a life she could never truly carry. She wrapped Jonathan in layers of lies, and he, exhausted from 12-hour days running his empire, believed what he wanted to see. Jonathan's schedule left no room for doubt. His life was a blur of boardrooms, deals, and late-night calls, his body worn and his mind clouded. When Victoria spoke of the baby kicking, he only smiled, too drained to question what he longed to believe. And when she finally placed the newborn in his arms, his knees weakened. He broke into tears, calling it a miracle, never once imagining that miracle was born from another woman's suffering. Victoria smiled as he named the boy Lucas, convincing herself she had saved her marriage. Jonathan's eyes shone with pride, but the foundation beneath their home was already cracked. One child was welcomed into a mansion of wealth and power, while his twin brother was left in a tiny room across the river, rocked to sleep by a mother who had lost half her heart. Ethan Carter grew up in the corners of a world that never noticed him. His shirts were hand-me-downs from donation bins, his shoes patched with tape when the soles came loose. At school, children laughed when they smelled the diner grease on his clothes and teased him about his mother working late shifts to serve strangers. Emily tried to shield him, walking him to school each morning with a smile that hid her exhaustion. She slipped change into his pocket for lunch, even if it meant she skipped her own meal. At night, she held him close and whispered that he was worth more than gold, though she herself was never sure how to believe it. Across the river, Lucas Hale woke up in a bedroom painted with murals of clouds and guarded by a nanny before he even rubbed the sleep from his eyes. His closet overflowed with designer clothes, toys stacked so high they touched the ceiling. He rode to his private academy in a black SUV with tinted windows, watched by security like a tiny prince. Yet even surrounded by comfort, Lucas often sat alone by the window. He held the latest toy, but his eyes wandered to the park across the street, where neighborhood kids shouted and chased each other freely. His mother dressed him in perfection, but his laughter was forced, as if joy itself was something purchased and not felt. One winter afternoon, Ethan stood outside a toy store, with his face pressed against the glass. Inside, glowing trains circled polished tracks, while stuffed animals filled the shelves. He whispered to himself that maybe one day he would have just one. Emily crouched beside him, placed her worn hands on his shoulders, and promised that one day she would give him a better life. Meanwhile, Lucas was inside a different store across town, handed every toy he pointed at. The cashier smiled at his mother as they carried bags to the car, but Lucas looked down at the ground. He mumbled that he wished he had someone to play with, someone who cared more about building forts in the yard than attending piano lessons. The contrast grew sharper as the boys aged. Ethan learned to hide his hunger behind jokes in the cafeteria, while Lucas learned to hide his loneliness behind polite nods at cocktail parties his parents hosted. Two brothers, separated by greed and deception, lived parallel lives. One longed for comfort, the other longed for connection, neither knowing they were searching for each other. One spring afternoon, Emily took Ethan to a small park in Manhattan, a rare treat after weeks of double shifts. She packed a simple sandwich and an apple, smiling as he ran toward the swings with laughter that seemed to brighten the grey city air. For a moment, she felt like any other mother, free from the weight of overdue bills and broken promises. Across the lawn, Jonathan Hale walked with Victoria, his mind still clouded by endless meetings and numbers. He slowed his steps when he saw Lucas running to the slide, his little arms waving. But then his eyes caught another boy nearby, a boy whose face was identical, down to the same eyes, the same curve of a smile. Jonathan froze, his breath shallow. Impossible, he thought. That child looked exactly like Lucas. He stepped closer, drawn by something stronger than reason, and asked the young woman nearby what her son's name was. Emily stiffened, fear flashing in her eyes, and quickly grabbed Ethan's hand. Without a word, she pulled him away, her heart pounding, while Ethan turned back, locking eyes with the man who stood frozen in disbelief. The moment seared Jonathan's mind. Those eyes, that hair, that was no coincidence. Later that evening, at the dinner table, he stared at Lucas longer than usual, comparing every detail of his face to the boy he had seen in the park. Victoria asked why he seemed distracted, but he shook his head, unwilling to voice the storm rising inside him. That night, when they were alone, Jonathan could no longer hold back. He turned to Victoria, his voice low but sharp, and asked how it was possible that another child in the city looked exactly like their son. Victoria laughed nervously, brushing it off as imagination, but her hands trembled as she lifted her wineglass. Jonathan's eyes stayed fixed on her, filled with suspicion and a fear he could not explain. The seed of doubt had been planted. The image of the boy clinging to his mother in the park haunted him through the night. Jonathan lay awake, his chest tight, replaying the look in that woman's eyes, a look that spoke of secrets she carried alone. He knew something was terribly wrong, and the answers would not stay hidden forever. Jonathan could no longer silence the storm in his chest. He hired a private investigator, and within weeks the truth came back in a thick file of receipts, forged papers, and bank transfers. Every page cut deeper. Victoria had worked with a corrupt doctor, arranging to buy a child on the very night Jonathan believed she had given birth. He confronted her in their Manhattan penthouse, slamming the file onto the polished dining table. His voice shook with rage as he demanded to know how long she thought she could bury the truth. Victoria's face drained of color, then hardened as she insisted she had done it for him, for their marriage, for the empire that needed an heir. Jonathan's fists clenched. His eyes burned as he shouted that she had not saved their family, she had poisoned it. "You didn't save this family," he spat. "You killed it the day you stole that child." The words echoed off the marble walls, louder than any deal he had ever made. Victoria broke down, falling to her knees, sobbing that she had no choice. She begged him to understand, to remember that he had once loved her. But Jonathan's fury only deepened. He told her that every smile, every tender moment, had been a lie, resting on the bones of another woman's grief. The house that once glittered with wealth now felt hollow. The silence after his words was heavier than glass, heavier than stone. Jonathan looked at the woman he once trusted more than anyone and saw only a stranger who had destroyed everything he thought was real. Emily sat at the small kitchen table of her rundown apartment, staring at the letter in her trembling hands. The landlord's words were sharp and final. She was being evicted for unpaid rent. Her chest tightened as tears spilled onto the paper, the weight of failure pressing down until she could hardly breathe. Ethan padded into the room, his little feet quiet on the cracked linoleum floor. He saw his mother crying and climbed into her lap, wrapping his thin arms around her neck. He whispered that he would be her little man, that he would take care of her even if the world would not. Emily clutched him tighter, guilt and love mixing into a pain that felt unbearable. Across town, Lucas sat in front of a polished grand piano in the Hale mansion, his small hands resting stiffly on the keys. Victoria stood over him, her voice sharp as she demanded perfection from every note. Lucas's eyes filled with tears as he whispered that he only wanted to play outside like the other kids, not spend hours trapped in lessons. His plea fell on deaf ears as the metronome ticked relentlessly on. The two boys lived worlds apart, yet their hearts carried the same ache. Ethan longed for a home that would not slip away with the next notice. Lucas longed for freedom from a life built on appearances and control. One cried because of poverty, the other because of privilege, but both felt caged in ways they could not understand. Jonathan watched it unfold in pieces, catching glimpses that twisted his soul. He had seen Emily holding her son's hand on a crowded sidewalk, her face pale with worry. He had heard Lucas crying behind the closed door of the music room, begging for something simple his wealth could never buy. The images haunted him, driving him toward a truth he was no longer willing to ignore. He began to plan his next move, determined to uncover the full story. His heart pounded with anger at the betrayal in his own home and pity for the woman struggling to survive with the child she had been left with. The walls of privilege and poverty had hidden the truth long enough. Jonathan knew it was time to break them down. Jonathan waited for her outside the diner, his face pale from sleepless nights and the weight of betrayal. When Emily stepped out, weary from her shift, he blocked her path with a voice that trembled between control and rage. He told her he needed a DNA test for her son. Emily froze, her breath sharp as if struck. She demanded to know who he thought he was, storming that no one had the right to question her motherhood. Her words cracked with fury as she shouted that Ethan was all she had, her flesh, her soul, her reason to wake up every morning. Jonathan held out the papers, his hands unsteady. He said this was not about her worth, but about the truth that had been buried for years. Emily's anger flared into something raw. She pushed the papers back into his chest, crying that men like him had always thought the poor could be questioned, dissected, treated as less than human. The test was done, and the results shattered the fragile wall she had built. Jonathan stood trembling as he read the words. Ethan and Lucas were twin brothers, separated at birth. When Emily heard, her knees gave out, her scream tearing through the small room. She clutched Ethan, rocking him as if he might vanish, sobbing that they had stolen her baby and left her with half a heart. Her grief was violent, a mother's wound ripped open. She cried that the world had already taken her future, and now it mocked her love with paperwork. Victoria entered, her body shaking. She collapsed before Jonathan, begging that he keep the secret, that she had only done it to save their marriage. Her sobs filled the air, but Jonathan's eyes were cold. He told her she had not saved anything, that she had already lost it all. The silence that followed was unbearable. Emily's cries, Jonathan's fury, and Victoria's collapse hung in the air like shards of glass. The truth had broken them, and nothing would ever be the same. Jonathan stood between two shattered worlds, his heart heavy with betrayal and grief. On one side was Victoria, broken by her own lies. On the other was Emily, clutching Ethan with the desperation of a mother who had lost too much already. Emily sobbed into her child's hair, her voice raw and cracked. She asked why the poor were always the ones crushed, why even their children could be stolen. Her words cut through the room like a knife, leaving silence in their wake. Jonathan knelt beside her, his voice quieter than it had ever been. He told her it was not the world, only people who thrived on cruelty. He promised he would not let that cruelty win again. For the first time, Emily looked at him not as a billionaire, but as a man carrying his own pain. Then the door creaked, and Lucas stepped in with wide, uncertain eyes. He froze when he saw Ethan. The two boys stared at each other, identical faces mirroring fear, confusion, and something deeper. Ethan's small voice broke the silence. He looked up at Emily and whispered, "Mom, why is he me?" Emily's chest caved in with a sob she could not hold back. Tears blurred her vision as she pulled Ethan closer, but she could not answer. Before she could speak, Ethan reached out his trembling hand. Lucas, just as stunned, moved closer and took it. The boys leaned into each other, arms wrapping tight. No words, just the instinct of blood and bond pulling them together. Their small shoulders shook as if they already understood the years they had lost. Emily cried harder, her face buried in her hands. Jonathan's vision blurred as he watched, his chest rising and falling with a pain he could not name. In that fragile embrace, truth defeated every lie. The cruelty that had divided them seemed powerless against the force of love, born the very moment they entered this world. The storm that had torn their lives apart finally moved into the public eye. Jonathan stood in court with evidence in his hands, exposing Victoria's lies and the doctor's crimes. The courtroom gasped as documents revealed a network of stolen newborns traded like property. The verdict was swift. The corrupt doctor was led away in handcuffs, his head bowed. Victoria sat silent, her face drained of pride, stripped of the wealth and image she had clung to for so long. Justice had finally pierced through the web of deceit. Emily, for the first time in years, stood tall. She was granted full custody of both Ethan and Lucas, her tears flowing freely as the judge declared what had once been stolen was rightfully hers again. She held both boys close, whispering that they would never be separated again. Jonathan approached her outside the courthouse, his voice steady but vulnerable. He said the boys deserved more than just survival. They deserved love and opportunities, a life with both parents willing to fight for them. His words carried no arrogance, only the humility of a man who had seen what really mattered. Emily's eyes shone with gratitude and caution. She told him it was not wealth or power that children needed most. It was family, arms that held them, voices that reassured them, hearts that never abandoned them. Jonathan nodded, realizing she was right, more than any lesson business or power had ever taught him. Weeks later, the park became their meeting ground once again. Ethan and Lucas ran across the grass, their laughter bright and unburdened, their hands clasped as if they had never been apart. Emily and Jonathan stood together watching, their smiles soft with healing, knowing that the future no longer had to be built on lies. The world had tried to divide them with cruelty, but the truth had brought them back together. In the end, what survived was not wealth or status, but love strong enough to mend what had been broken. This journey began with a secret buried in lies and ended with a mother reclaiming the child stolen from her arms. It is proof that justice, though late, still shines when truth is revealed. Emily's tears carried the weight of every mother who has been silenced, and Jonathan's change showed that even the powerful can choose compassion. If this story touched you, share your thoughts below and let your voice join this echo. Subscribe, like, and share emotional echoes so these lessons of love and justice can reach more souls. Thanks for listening.